Sergeant Gilbert Farley's laughter cut through the Kandahar training field like a blade through canvas. "Shoot this, and my money's yours," he barked, waving a crisp stack of bills, $720, his week's combat pay, before shoving the XM7 rifle toward the ragged beggar boy at the camp's edge. The beggar didn't flinch. 19, barefoot, dust-caked skin stretched over visible ribs. His dark eyes found the rifle, then the sergeant, steady and unreadable as desert stone. "Your money?" James Hawes said softly, his voice barely audible over the idling armored trucks. "Keep it. I only shoot what matters." The platoon erupted. 12 soldiers in tactical gear, faces red from sun and amusement, slapping knees and elbowing each other. The muscular sergeant, olive green shirt clinging to his frame, veins bulging from forearms thick as cables, grinned wider, mistaking the boy's calm for fear. "Go on, boy," Gilbert taunted, his Harvard-trained accent sharp with superiority. "Show me you even know which end points forward." Behind them, the smell of gun oil, sweat, and sand hung in the 110-degree heat. The metal target glinted at 50 meters. An impossible shot for a starving beggar who probably hadn't held anything heavier than a cup in weeks. James said nothing. His torn shirt revealed the faint outline of ribs. But his hands, those hands shook not from weakness but from restraint, from memories, from muscle memory fighting to stay buried. The XM7 was intimately familiar, its weight triggering something ancient and terrible in his bones. $720. The exact amount needed for a week's shelter at the refugee center. The exact distance between sleeping under canvas or under stars. Between one more meal or one more day spent scavenging ration waste from dumpsters outside the American compound. His fingers brushed the empty space at his hip, where, 6 years ago, a different rifle had hung. A different life. A different child entirely. Would revealing his true self to those who saw him as trash bring salvation, or merely drag his past into the merciless light? The question hung in the scorching air like a bullet already fired, but not yet landed. Before we get started, don't forget to give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us bring you even more incredible stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into the story. James lifted the XM7 with surprising familiarity, pressed the stock to his shoulder, and exhaled slowly. The world seemed to still, the laughter fading, the wind dropping, the earth itself holding its breath. A single shot cracked the silence. The metal target at 50 meters rang like a bell, a perfect hole blooming dead center. And Gilbert Farley, the man who laughed first, suddenly stood speechless. James hadn't always been a beggar. 9 years ago, he was the bright-eyed 10-year-old who could field strip an AK-47 in 42 seconds. While other children learned multiplication tables, James learned windage calculations and breathing techniques. Not by choice. Never by choice. His father, Marcus Hawes, had been a farmer in Relengo province before the warlords came. Before Commander Okello's Red Scars militia rolled through their village like a plague, conscripting every boy over the age of 8. Marcus had tried to hide James in the root cellar. They'd found him anyway. "Soldiers are made, not born," Commander Okello had told the terrified children that first night, his breath reeking of palm wine and violence. "You will learn, or you will be lessons for those who do." James learned. At 10, he could hit moving targets at 200 meters. At 11, he earned the nickname Ghost, the child sniper who could drop enemy convoy drivers with single shots that seemed to come from nowhere. At 12, he watched his best friend Kofi bleed out from an infected wound, crying for a mother who had been dead 2 years. His father had tried to protect him even from inside the militia camp, where Marcus was forced to work as a mechanic. Small acts of defiance, hiding ammunition, sabotaging vehicles just enough to delay but not reveal. When Commander Okello discovered the truth, he made an example that 13-year-old James would never forget. The rifle they forced into his trembling hands that day was an American-made XM7, looted from a supply convoy. "You'll use their weapons, or your father dies slowly," Okello had whispered. James had refused, had thrown the rifle at Okello's feet, had chosen his father over survival. They shot Marcus Hawes in the village square, in front of everyone, including James. The same XM7 he'd refused to touch. The last thing his father said, "Don't become what they want. Remember who you are." 3 months later, during a peacekeeping raid, explosions had torn through the Red Scars compound. In the chaos, James ran. For 2 days, he moved through the savannah with only the stars and his training, until he collapsed outside a UN convoy checkpoint. An American soldier with kind eyes and medical supplies had saved his mother, Sarah, from the rubble of their destroyed village during that same raid. James never learned the soldier's name, only remembered his unit insignia, remembered trying to thank him through tears and trauma, remembered the soldier saying, "Get somewhere safe, kid. This war isn't yours anymore." Now, at 19, James had spent 6 years drifting. The trauma had left him with nightmares that made sleep impossible, hypervigilance that made peace unbearable. Sarah had tried to rebuild in the refugee settlements, but the stroke 3 years ago left her partially paralyzed, dependent on James for everything. His days followed a brutal rhythm. Dawn to noon, scavenging and doing odd labor for 3 to 7 per day. Noon to dusk, caring for Sarah in their canvas shelter at the refugee camp. Dusk to midnight, walking the perimeter of military compounds, searching for the face he half remembered. The soldier whose kindness had been the only light in his darkest hour. 21 hours of survival each week yielded barely enough for Sarah's medications, $28 for antibiotics, $15 for blood pressure pills from the black market pharmacy, ours for their portion of the shared tent, $8 for food. The arithmetic of refugee existence left nothing for dignity, for hope. For 6 months, James had haunted the edges of the Kandahar base, watching soldiers who looked through him as if he were already a ghost. He'd learned to make himself invisible while his eyes caught everything. Their routines, their blind spots, their unit insignias. When he'd finally spotted the patch, that specific combination of symbols, his heart had stopped. The man who'd saved his mother wore sergeant's stripes now. Sergeant Gilbert Farley. The name tag visible even from a distance. But watching Farley laugh with his platoon, mock the local trash, boast about shooting scores while beggar children starved meters away, James had said nothing, had swallowed his gratitude, his hope, his desperate need to connect with the one good memory in his ocean of trauma. Until the challenge, until the rifle, until the weapon that destroyed his childhood was thrust into his hands again, this time wrapped in mockery and money. Knowledge without power, skill without opportunity. James emptied their trash while understanding every tactical discussion, every complaint about these people, every joke about refugees being professional beggars. He knew Sergeant Farley had a daughter back home named Emma, same age James had been when the war took him. He knew Farley sent half his pay to her college fund. He knew the sergeant had once been different, kinder, perhaps, before cynicism and multiple deployments hardened him into this laughing, arrogant man. He knew that tomorrow, Command planned to abandon the nearby refugee village, citing resource constraints, the same abandonment that created child soldiers like James years ago. Knowledge without voice. Truth without audience. James had cleaned their boot prints from the floor while understanding every word about duty, honor, and the sacrifices they made. But now the rifle was in his hands again, and 12 pairs of eyes watched to see if the beggar would embarrass himself. This time, James thought, his finger finding the trigger with terrible muscle memory. This time, I choose what the shot means. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Corporal Hayes broke it with a low whistle. Holy shit! Gilbert blinked, still staring at the target swaying gently in the breeze, the hole punched dead center, like a textbook example from sniper school. His mouth had gone dry. Around him, the platoon stirred, uncertain laughter, exchanged glances, the shuffling of boots in sand. Beginner's luck, Gilbert heard himself say, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Anyone can get lucky once. Then let him try again, someone called out. It was Martinez, always eager for entertainment. Double or nothing, Sarge. Your 2 weeks' pay says he can't do it twice. The suggestion rippled through the group like electricity. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, pulling out wallets, shouting odds. The afternoon's boredom had transformed into something alive, hungry for spectacle. Gilbert felt the moment slipping from his control. He'd meant to humiliate the beggar, remind him of his place, maybe toss him a 20 afterward for the amusement. Instead, the kid stood there holding the XM7 like it was an extension of his body, waiting with that same unreadable calm. Fine, Gilbert said, snatching the rifle back. He checked the chamber, reloaded, made a show of examining the weapon, as if the beggar might have tampered with it somehow. But let's make it interesting. Over the next 40 minutes, it became a circus. They made James shoot, kneeling. He hit center mass. They made him shoot from prone position at 75 meters. He adjusted for wind and nailed it. Corporal Hayes tied a blindfold, an actual tactical blindfold from his pack, around James's eyes. Let's see you get lucky now, kid. James stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats. Then, moving only by sound and memory, he raised the rifle, made a minute adjustment, and fired. The target sang. When Hayes pulled off the blindfold, his hands were shaking slightly. That's not normal. Moving target, Gilbert heard himself say, his voice tight. Set up the moving target. They rigged a piece of plywood to a rope system they used for advanced drills, a target that swung in an arc at 60 meters, simulating a running enemy. It was difficult even for experienced marksmen. James tracked it for 2 seconds, led the target by what looked like pure instinct, and fired. The plywood spun violently, a hole torn through the painted silhouette's center mass. The laughter had died completely now. What remained was something else, a mixture of awe, confusion, and for some, a creeping unease. These were trained soldiers, men who'd spent years perfecting their craft, watching a barefoot beggar in rags outshoot half the platoon without breaking a sweat. Gilbert noticed it first, the boys' hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were absolutely steady, moving with mechanical precision, each motion economical and practiced. The stance, the breathing pattern, the way he naturally found proper sight alignment, These weren't things you learned from desperation or luck. This was training. Military training. The kind that came from repetition under pressure, from muscle memory beaten in by necessity. Gilbert had seen it before. In Relengo province 6 years back, when his unit had faced an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. When convoy drivers dropped from single shots that came from nowhere. When the locals whispered about a ghost child who could kill from distances that shouldn't have been possible for... No, that was ridiculous. "All right, that's enough," Gilbert said abruptly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Show's over. Back to your duties." "But Sarge, the bet! I said, show's over!" The snap in his voice silenced the protests. Gilbert pulled $720 from his wallet, money meant for Emma's birthday gift, and shoved it toward James. "Take it. You earned it. Now get out of here." James looked at the money for a long moment. Then, carefully, he peeled off $200 and handed the rest back. "Just enough for medicine," he said quietly. "I don't need your guilt." He turned and walked toward the camp gates, the XM7 still in his hands, until Hayes nervously retrieved it. The afternoon sun hammered down as the soldiers dispersed, subdued, their earlier excitement curdled into something uncomfortable. Private Dawson, barely 20, fresh from his first deployment, watched the beggar's retreating figure and felt something twist in his chest. He grabbed 2 water bottles from the supply tent and jogged after James, catching him near the perimeter fence. "Hey, wait up!" James stopped but didn't turn. "Here." Dawson held out the water. You were out there a while in the heat." James took one bottle after a pause, his dark eyes studying Dawson with an intensity that made the young soldier want to look away. Up close, Dawson could see the scars. Thin white lines across the boy's forearms, a puckered mark on his shoulder that looked like an old bullet wound. "Where'd you learn that?" Dawson asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "To shoot like that, I mean. That wasn't normal." James opened the water bottle, drank deeply, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of old stones. "I learned when missing meant dying." "But you're so young. How could you—" "Young?" Something almost like a smile crossed James's face, but it held no humor. "I stopped being young at 10. You want to know where I learned? I learned in places where children are cheaper than bullets, where commanders put rifles in hands too small to hold them properly and said, 'Shoot or be shot.' I learned by watching friends die from infections because bandages were luxuries. I learned because the alternative was becoming another body in an unmarked grave." Dawson felt sick. Jesus, which militia? But James was already walking away, the $200 folded carefully in his pocket, his bare feet leaving prints in the dust that the wind would erase within minutes. That night, Gilbert Farley lay on his bunk, staring at the metal ceiling of his quarters while the bass generator hummed its monotonous song. Around him, the other NCOs slept or pretended to, but his mind churned like an engine he couldn't shut off. He kept seeing it, the way the beggar's hands had moved, the breathing pattern. 4 seconds in, hold, squeeze, on the exhale, textbook sniper technique. The stance adjustment for the moving target, compensating for arc and wind without hesitation. And those eyes, not angry, not grateful, just empty. The kind of empty Gilbert had seen in soldiers after their 3rd or 4th tour, when the humanity started leaking out through cracks in their armor. I learned when missing meant dying. Gilbert's hand found his phone, scrolling through old deployment photos until he found the ones from Relengo, his unit standing beside burned-out vehicles, the village they'd evacuated, the reports about the Red Scars militia and their use of child soldiers, the intelligence briefing that mentioned a ghost sniper, a child, they'd said, no older than 13, who had been responsible for at least 15 confirmed kills before the peacekeeping raid scattered the militia. They'd never found that child, assumed he'd died in the fighting, or been evacuated, or simply disappeared into the chaos that swallowed so many war orphans. Gilbert zoomed in on one photo, himself, younger, less weathered, kneeling beside a woman pulled from rubble. Behind her, partially visible in the frame's edge, a thin boy with dark eyes and dust-covered skin. The resolution was too poor to be certain. The boy's face was turned away, obscured by smoke and distance. But something in Gilbert's gut twisted with recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. He deleted the photo search and put the phone away, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, the desert wind howled against the prefab walls, carrying with it the ghost of a question he wasn't ready to ask. What if the boy he'd mocked today was the same ghost who'd haunted his nightmares for 6 years? And if so, God help him, what had he done? The MRE-packaged chili mac was cold, but James ate it like communion, slowly, deliberately, each bite a small miracle. He sat with his back against the corrugated metal wall behind the barracks, hidden in the shadow where the floodlights didn't quite reach. Dawson crouched beside him, pretending to check equipment while actually standing watch. "You don't have to do this," James said quietly, not looking up from the plastic pouch. "Yeah, I do." Dawson shifted his weight, his M4 slung awkwardly across his back. "What happened today? That wasn't right. The way Sarge treated you. Your sergeant treated me exactly how the world treats people like me." James scraped the last of the food from the package. At least he paid his bet. Dawson handed over a protein bar, then a second one when James hesitated. "Keep them. I've got plenty." For a moment, they sat in silence, punctuated only by the distant generator hum and the occasional shout from the rec tent. Then Dawson asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the afternoon. "Relengo Province. You said you learned to shoot there. Were you—" He struggled with the words. "Were you with the Red Scars?" James's hands stopped moving. When he spoke again, his voice carried the flat affect of someone reciting facts from a police report. "I was 9 when they came. The Red Scars Militia, Commander Okello's faction. They burned our village because the elders refused to provide supplies. My father, his name was Marcus Hawes, he was a school teacher. He tried to hide families in the school building, tried to save the children." Dawson felt his stomach drop. What happened? They lined up everyone who'd helped him, made the whole village watch. James's fingers tightened around the empty food package, crinkling the plastic. "My father stood in front of 12 people he'd tried to protect. Commander Okello gave him a choice: join the militia or die with them. My father spit at his feet." The night air suddenly felt colder. "They shot him first, made sure it was slow, then the others. Then they took every boy over 8 years old, including me. Said we'd learn to be soldiers or we'd be lessons for those who did." James's voice remained steady, but Dawson could see his jaw working. "That night, they gave us each a rifle and 20 bullets. Told us we had 1 week to bring back proof of 20 kills. Animals, people, they didn't care which. Anyone who came back with less than 20 would be the 21st. Jesus Christ! Dawson's hand had unconsciously moved to his sidearm, as if he could somehow reach back through time and shoot the monsters who'd done this. "I learned fast. Had to. Some of the other boys, they couldn't do it. Couldn't make themselves kill, even to survive. I watched them get executed one by one until I stopped learning their names. James finally looked at Dawson, and in the weak light, his eyes were ancient. By 10, I could hit a moving target at 200 meters. By 11, I was point man for convoy ambushes. They called me Ghost because I could shoot from positions that shouldn't have been possible. I'd hit the driver, disappear before anyone figured out where the shot came from. How many? Dawson stopped himself. How many people did I kill? James finished. I stopped counting after 30. That was within the first year. The protein bars sat forgotten between them. Dawson tried to process what he was hearing. Tried to reconcile the starving beggar with the child killer, tried to find moral footing in a story that obliterated easy judgments. My mother survived the initial raid, James continued. They kept her in the camp, cooking and cleaning for the militia. Every night I saw her, I had to pretend I was becoming what they wanted. Had to let her think I was learning to survive, not learning to become a monster. When I was 13, my father's brother tried to organize an escape. Commander Okello found out. Let me guess. He made me the executioner. James's voice finally cracked. Gave me the XM7 they'd looted from an American convoy. Said if I didn't shoot my uncle, he'd kill my mother in front of me, slowly. He'd make it last days. Dawson didn't dare breathe. I refused, threw the rifle at his feet, told him to do his worst. A ghost of something, pride maybe, or just exhaustion, crossed James's face. He beat me unconscious. When I woke up, my uncle was dead, but my mother was still alive. Okello kept her alive just to punish me, to show me what my defiance cost. How did you get out? Peacekeeping raid, 6 years ago. Americans, mostly. They hit the compound at dawn, drones, artillery, the works. In the chaos, I ran. Didn't stop for 2 days, until I collapsed outside a UN checkpoint. A soldier found my mother in the rubble of our old village during the same raid. She'd been living there, waiting for me, hoping I'd come back. James's voice softened. He saved her life. American sergeant. Couldn't have been more than 30. He gave her medical supplies, called in an evac. I tried to thank him, but I was half dead from dehydration and trauma. Never got his name. Just remembered his unit patch. The pieces clicked in Dawson's mind with horrible clarity. The same patch. The same one Sergeant Farley wears. 500 meters away, in the operations briefing room, Gilbert Farley sat through his third intelligence update of the week and felt reality tilting sideways. The PowerPoint slide showed grainy surveillance photos of burned-out villages along the Ralengo border. Captain Morrison's voice droned through the tactical assessment. Red Scar's militia activity has increased 40% in the last quarter. They're reorganizing, recruiting from refugee camps, and we've got reports of weapons smuggling through the Kandara corridor. Gilbert barely heard it. His attention had snagged on a single line in the intelligence summary displayed on his tablet. Historical note: during 2016 to 2019 operations, enemy forces employed juvenile combatants with advanced marksmanship training. One asset, designated Ghost, was attributed with 47 confirmed kills before disappearing during Operation Sand Shield. Status unknown. Presumed KIA or trafficked. His hands had gone numb. Farley, you with us? Gilbert looked up to find Morrison staring at him. Sir, the Ghost asset. Do we have any additional intel? Morrison frowned. Ancient history, Sergeant. Why? Just curious. I was there during Sand Shield. Heard stories about a kid sniper, never saw confirmation. There wasn't much to confirm. By the time we rolled through, most of the child soldiers were scattered or dead. The ones we did recover were too traumatized to provide useful intelligence. Morrison clicked to the next slide. The concerning part is that whoever trained those kids is active again. Same methodologies showing up in recent attacks. The briefing continued, but Gilbert's mind had locked onto a single impossible thought. 47 confirmed kills. Disappeared during Sand Shield. Ghost. He thought about the beggar's stance, the breathing pattern, the way he'd handled the XM7 like greeting an old enemy. The scars visible on his arms, the age, 19 now, which meant he'd have been 13 during Sand Shield. I learned when missing meant dying. Gilbert pulled up his phone under the table, scrolling back through deployment photos with shaking hands. He found the one from 2019, the village evacuation, the woman he'd pulled from rubble, the thin boy behind her with haunted eyes. He zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. The boy's face was partially obscured, turned away from the camera. But something about the jawline, the set of his shoulders. "Sergeant Farley, anything to add?" Gilbert looked up, realized the entire room was waiting for his response to a question he hadn't heard. "No, sir, nothing to add." But that was a lie, because as he sat in that briefing room, surrounded by officers planning operations against an enemy they'd been fighting for a decade, Gilbert Farley realized that the most dangerous weapon they'd ever faced wasn't resurgent. It was starving just outside their fence, and he'd spent the afternoon humiliating it for sport. Gilbert found him at dawn, on his knees beside Lieutenant Hayes's tent, a boot brush moving in practiced circles over mud-caked leather. 3 pairs already sat cleaned and drying on a canvas tarp. 50 cents per pair, James had told Dawson. $1.50 for 2 hours of work that left his hands cramped and his back aching. The sergeant stood there for a full minute before James acknowledged him, though they both knew he'd sensed the presence immediately. When James finally looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, the face of someone who'd learned to show nothing. "You do good work," Gilbert said, then immediately regretted how patronizing it sounded. "That's what people say when they don't want to acknowledge what you actually are." James returned to the boot, his strokes methodical. "But thank you." Gilbert shifted his weight, the XM7 rifle slung across his back, suddenly feeling heavier than its 9 pounds. He'd carried it here deliberately, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Throughout the night, in the spaces between Morrison's intelligence briefing and dawn, he'd assembled pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to complete. "I need to ask you something. You're a sergeant. You don't need permission to ask anything. Where were you during Operation Sand Shield, June 2019? James's hand stopped moving. The silence stretched like wire pulled taut. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I think—" Gilbert caught himself, realizing how insane it would sound. "Because I was there. Relengo Province. We hit a Red Scars compound at dawn. Evacuated civilians from 3 villages. There was a boy, about 13, with his mother. I gave them medical supplies, called in an evac." He paused. "I think that boy was you." James set down the boot brush with deliberate care. When he stood, the morning sun caught the scars on his forearms. Thin white lines that could have been from barbed wire or deliberate cuts. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I've been looking for you for 6 months." The admission hung between them like smoke. Gilbert unslung the rifle, holding it at port arms. The metal caught the light, cold and precise. Then you know what this is. XM7, standard issue now, though it wasn't during my time. James's eyes tracked the weapon with something that might have been recognition or revulsion. You used those during the raid? We did. Found a cache of them in the compound. Red Scars had looted them from one of our supply convoys. Gilbert extended the rifle toward James. I need you to tell me something. Do you even know what this weapon took from you? James didn't reach for it. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Do you even know what that weapon gave you? What? Your career. Your medals. Your clean conscience. James took a step closer, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. That rifle let you swoop in, destroy the monsters, save the victims, and fly away feeling righteous. You never had to stay and count the bodies, never had to watch villages starve because your liberation destroyed their food supplies, never had to see children conscripted again 3 months later because your mission created a power vacuum. Gilbert felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's not. We were trying to help. I know. And somehow that made it worse. The lack of anger in James's voice, just exhausted acknowledgement. Commander Okello forced that exact model into my hands when I was 13. Said if I didn't execute my uncle with it, he'd kill my mother. I refused. You know what happened? They beat me until I couldn't stand, killed my uncle anyway, and kept my mother alive just to punish me with her presence. He finally reached out and took the rifle, his hands finding their positions with muscle memory that made Gilbert's skin crawl. 6 days later, your raid destroyed the compound. I ran. My mother survived. And I spent 6 years telling myself that the American soldiers were different, that you were heroes, not just killers with better equipment and nicer flags. James's fingers traced the weapon's profile. You think soldiers and killers are different? We have rules, laws of warfare. You have the luxury of choosing when to follow them. James shouldered the rifle, his form textbook perfect despite the ragged clothes. Do you know what the difference is between me and you, Sergeant? When you kill someone from a compound you can't pronounce, in a country you'll leave in 12 months, they call it service. When I killed to survive in the only home I've ever known, they called me a monster. Gilbert opened his mouth, then closed it. What defense could he offer? That his orders came from legitimate authority? That his kills were sanctioned by international law? That he'd only been following? The thought died before completion. He'd heard that excuse before, in history books, and it had never sounded righteous. I watched you that day, James continued, his voice softening. When you found my mother in the rubble, you were kind, gentle. You treated her like she mattered, not like collateral. For 6 years, I held on to that memory, proof that not everyone with a gun was a devil. He handed the rifle back. Then I found you, and you were laughing, calling refugees trash, making bets on whether a starving boy could shoot. The rifle felt like an accusation in Gilbert's hands. Which version is real? Sergeant Farley, the man who saved my mother or the man who mocked her son? Gilbert had no answer. The question carved away at foundations he'd built his entire identity on. The certainty that he was one of the good guys, that his deployments meant something beyond geopolitical chess moves and career advancement. I don't know, he finally admitted. At least that's honest. James picked up the boot brush. Your lieutenant's boots are almost done. That'll be 50 cents. Gilbert walked away in a daze, his conversation with James replaying like a damaged recording. Around him, The camp was waking up, soldiers emerging for morning PT, vehicles starting their daily maintenance, the machinery of military routine grinding forward. He thought about Operation Sand Shield, about the commendations he'd received for actions during that raid, about the photos on his phone showing proud moments he'd never questioned. You never had to stay and count the bodies. Had there been bodies beyond the enemy combatants? Civilians caught in crossfire? Children too slow to evacuate? His after-action report had used phrases like acceptable collateral damage and strategic necessity, clinical language that sanitized horror into statistics. He thought about his daughter Emma, safe in Colorado, attending school, worried only about algebra tests and soccer tryouts. Then he thought about James at 9, learning to kill or be killed, watching his father executed, his childhood incinerated by men with rifles and ideologies. What separated the two fates? Geography? Economics? The accident of birth? Or just power? And who held the rifles? That afternoon, while the base drowsed in the heat, James walked to the ruins of the old refugee settlement 3 kilometers north. The canvas shelters had been torn down months ago, the residents relocated or dispersed, leaving only trash and memories scattered across the sand. He found the spot where his mother's tent had stood before the stroke, where they'd shared meals of donated rice and hoped for futures that seemed increasingly impossible. He knelt, digging with his hands until he'd created a small depression in the earth. From his pocket, he withdrew a brass casing, .308 caliber, corroded green with age. He'd carried it for 6 years, ever since fleeing the Red Scars compound. The casing from the first shot he'd ever fired, at age 9, hitting a target he could no longer remember, but whose death he'd never forget. James placed the casing in the depression and covered it with sand. No prayers, no ceremony, just the quiet burial of a piece of himself he couldn't carry anymore. When he stood, his hands were shaking, not from weakness, but from something he couldn't name. Release, maybe, or just acknowledgement that some weights couldn't be set down, only redistributed. The desert wind erased his footprints as he walked back toward the fence, back toward the base where men who'd never counted their own bodies prepared for the next deployment. Behind him, buried in sand that would shift and scatter, a small piece of metal marked a grave that had no name. Just another casualty the official reports would never count. The memo came through on Tuesday morning, marked confidential, command personnel only. Gilbert read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less damning. Operational Directive, 2025, October 19th. Resource Reallocation, Kandara Sector, effective 31, October 2025. All humanitarian support operations for Refugee Settlement Zone 7, coordinates attached, will cease. Personnel are instructed to withdraw support infrastructure and redirect resources to primary mission objectives. Local population relocation is not within mission parameters. NGO notification will be handled through diplomatic channels. Rationale: current geopolitical priorities require consolidated resource allocation. Settlement Zone 7 presents minimal strategic value and elevated security risk. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, the kind of prose designed to obscure human cost behind acronyms and bullet points. Gilbert knew what it meant. 1,500 refugees, mostly women and children, would lose access to water purification, medical supplies, and the minimal security presence that kept the worst predators at bay. They'd be left to scatter into the desert or drift toward militia-controlled territories, the same territories that had created child soldiers like James. History repeating itself, signed in triplicate. In the NCO tent that evening, the reaction was predictable. "About damn time," Corporal Hayes said, tossing the memo on the table with satisfaction. "We've been babysitting that camp for 8 months. Let the UN handle it. It's their job." "Means fewer patrols," Martinez added, already calculating. "We can focus on actual security operations instead of playing humanitarian." Lieutenant Morrison raised his beer in mock salute. "To resource reallocation. May it always reallocate away from our problem list." Laughter rippled through the tent. Gilbert sat silent, the memo in his hands feeling heavier than paper should. Around him, men he'd served with for years, good men, competent soldiers, celebrated the erasure of 1,500 lives from their responsibility ledger. "What's wrong, Sarge?" Hayes noticed his expression. "You've been weird all week. This is good news, is it?" "Hell yes, those people aren't our problem. We've got actual threats to worry about. Red Scar's activity is up. We've got border incursions and we're undermanned as it is." Hayes leaned back. "Sometimes you've got to make hard choices. Command gets that." Gilbert thought about a 13-year-old boy running through artillery fire because the people who were supposed to protect him had made hard choices instead. "Right," he said quietly. "Hard choices." He left the tent before anyone could see his hands shaking. James was emptying trash from the mess hall when he saw it. The memo, partially visible in a recycling bin, marked with coffee rings, but still legible. He'd learned to read classified documents by their headers, their formatting, the particular syntax of military orders. This one took him 30 seconds to scan, 60 seconds to understand, 90 seconds to feel the past collapse into the present like a building imploding in slow motion. Effective 31. October 2025. All humanitarian support operations for Refugee Settlement Zone 7 will cease. Zone 7, where his mother lived now, in a canvas tent barely large enough to lie down in, where 300 other families survived on the margins of survival, sustained only by the intermittent mercy of foreign soldiers who could withdraw that mercy with a memo. James's hands crumpled the paper. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet kitchen. He'd been 9 when the last resource reallocation happened. When the previous peacekeeping force had pulled out of Relengo province, declaring the mission accomplished, leaving a power vacuum that militias filled within weeks. He remembered the day the water trucks stopped coming, the day the medical clinic closed, the day Commander Okello's trucks rolled into a village that had no one left to protect it. Sometimes you've got to make hard choices. He'd heard that before, too, from the UN worker who'd explained why they couldn't evacuate his village, from the aid coordinator who'd rationed food because resources were limited, from every well-meaning person who'd ever decided that survival was a privilege, not a right, and that some people simply didn't make the cut. James walked out of the mess hall, past the rows of climate-controlled tents, past soldiers laughing about reduced patrol schedules, past the equipment that cost more than his mother's settlement had seen in aggregate aid over 5 years. He found Gilbert near the armory, conducting an evening weapons inventory. The sergeant looked up, and something in James's expression made him set down his clipboard. "What happened?" "Zone 7, James said, his voice controlled but vibrating with something dangerous. "You're abandoning it." Gilbert's face confirmed everything. "It's not my decision." "It never is." James stepped closer. The perimeter lights cast harsh shadows across his features. 6 years ago, peacekeepers pulled out of my province, made the hard choice, left us to the militias because resources were limited and strategic value was minimal. You know what happened next? James, children became soldiers, women became property, villages became graveyards, all because someone in an air-conditioned office decided that saving us wasn't cost-effective. His hands clenched. My mother is in Zone 7. 300 families are in Zone 7. In 2 weeks, they'll be exactly where I was 6 years ago, abandoned, desperate, and perfect prey for the same monsters you claim to fight. Gilbert couldn't hold his gaze. I don't make policy. I follow orders. You told me to shoot for your money, James said, his voice dropping to something raw and terrible. Made it a joke, a bet, entertainment. Now I'm asking you, what will you shoot for, Sergeant? What's worth pulling the trigger? Because if it's just orders and paychecks and staying comfortable, then you're no different than Commander Okello. You just wear a nicer uniform. The comparison hit like a physical blow. Gilbert's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Fair? James laughed, and the sound carried 6 years of swallowed rage. You want to talk about fair? I was forced to become a killer to survive. You choose to be one every time you follow orders you know are wrong. At least I can say I had no choice. What's your excuse? He turned and walked away, leaving Gilbert standing alone in the armory's fluorescent light, the inventory forgotten, the question hanging in the air like cordite. Gilbert couldn't sleep. At 200 hours, he gave up trying and pulled on his uniform, walking to the command tent where Captain Morrison was reviewing supply manifests. Sir, I need to talk about the Zone 7 directive. Morrison didn't look up. Nothing to discuss, Sergeant. Orders are orders. Sir, those refugees will have nowhere to go. Without our support, they'll do what refugees have always done. Find new camps, new sponsors, new aid organizations. Morrison finally met his eyes. Farley, I know you're feeling some kind of way about this, but we're soldiers, not social workers. Our job is to maintain security in this sector, and right now that means consolidating resources where they matter strategically. 1,500 people are not our responsibility, Morrison's voice sharpened. We've got Red Scars activity increasing, border tensions escalating, and a mandate that doesn't include indefinite humanitarian operations. You want to save every refugee in this country? Join the Peace Corps. But while you're wearing that uniform, you follow orders. Clear? Sir, if we abandon them, we're creating the next generation of militants. We're making the same mistakes. Stand down, Sergeant. Morrison's tone went cold. This conversation is over. The directive stands. If you have a problem with that, take it up with JAG. But I suggest you don't, because questioning lawful orders is a court-martial offense. Gilbert stood at attention, every word of protest dying in his throat. Years of conditioning, of hierarchy, of following the chain of command. It all pulled him toward the only acceptable response. Yes, sir. But as he walked back to his quarters through the pre-dawn darkness, the obedience felt like betrayal. He thought about James at 13, running from a compound while American bombs fell, about the woman he'd pulled from rubble, who'd been abandoned once already and would be abandoned again, about his daughter Emma, who'd never know what it meant to be told her life had minimal strategic value, about all the times he'd followed orders without questioning where they led, who they hurt, what they cost. In his tent, Gilbert pulled up the Zone 7 coordinates on his tablet. Medical supplies in storage, enough for 6 months. water purification equipment, functional but scheduled for reallocation, food stores, adequate but tagged for return to central supply. Everything these people needed to survive, sitting in warehouses because paperwork said it belonged elsewhere. He thought about his career, 15 years of service, commendations, a pension waiting at the end. Thought about Emma's college fund, his mother's medical expenses back in Denver, the security that came with following orders. Then he thought about James's question. What will you shoot for? The answer required choosing between the man he'd been and the man he might become. Between comfort and conscience. Between orders and what was right. Gilbert closed the tablet and sat in darkness, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down like all the rifles he'd ever carried. Dawn was 3 hours away. He had until then to decide which version of himself would face the morning. Gilbert made his decision at 0427 hours, watching the sun bleed into the horizon like a wound opening. He'd spent the last 3 hours of darkness moving through the base with the careful precision of someone committing a crime. Because that's exactly what this was. Unauthorized resource allocation, defiance of direct orders, career suicide wrapped in canvas tarps and loaded onto M35 cargo trucks. The first truck held medical supplies, antibiotics, IV fluids, anti-malarials, bandages. Enough to sustain Zone 7's makeshift clinic for 4 months, all pulled from the surplus inventory that was scheduled for return to central supply. The second truck carried water purification tablets, portable filtration units, and 75 gallons of potable water in jerry cans. The third held food, MREs, rice bags, powdered milk, protein supplements. Everything the memo had designated for reallocation. Everything Gilbert was stealing. Dawson appeared from behind the motor pool at 0445, his face pale in the pre-dawn light. Sarge, if we do this, then don't. Gilbert secured a cargo strap without looking at him. I'm not ordering anyone. This is on me. That's not what I meant. Dawson checked the truck's tire pressure, his movements automatic. I meant, if we do this, we do it right. We'll need someone who knows the terrain, the back roads, where the Red Scars patrol. I've got maps. Maps won't tell you where they buried IEDs last week. A voice emerged from the shadows near the fence line. James stepped into the light, wearing boots someone had given him, probably Dawson, and carrying a tactical pack that looked military surplus. But I can. Gilbert's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, then stopped. How long have you been there? Long enough to watch you load 3 trucks with enough supplies to trigger a court-martial. James moved closer, his gait steady despite the limp Gilbert noticed for the first time. You're taking the main highway to Zone 7. Direct route, 43 kilometers. You'll be ambushed at the 20-kilometer mark, where the road narrows through the canyon. How do you... Because that's where I'd ambush you. James's voice carried the flat certainty of experience. Red Scars have been watching this base for weeks. They know your patterns, your vehicle signatures, your response times. A convoy leaving at dawn, heading northwest. They'll have spotters reporting it within 15 minutes. Dawson exchanged a glance with Gilbert. Then what's the alternative? The old mining route, 58 kilometers. Rougher terrain, but it runs through areas the Red Scars abandoned after the 2019 raids. Too many bad memories. Something flickered across James's face. I know it. Every kilometer, every blind spot, every place where a truck could break an axle or a sniper could set up. Gilbert studied him in the growing light. This 19-year-old who'd been a beggar 4 days ago and was now offering tactical intelligence like a seasoned scout. Why would you help us? My mother is in Zone 7. If you're going, I'm going. James shouldered the pack. Unless you plan to stop me, Sergeant. They both knew he wouldn't. The third man arrived at 0510, Private First Class Michael Chen, a combat engineer with 2 deployments and a reputation for being able to fix anything mechanical. He took one look at the loaded trucks and understood immediately. Sir, with respect, this is insane. I know. Morrison will have you court-martialed. I know. Chen was quiet for a moment, then climbed into the lead truck's passenger seat. My grandmother was a refugee, Vietnamese boat person. Someone helped her when they didn't have to. He fastened his seatbelt. Guess it's time to pay that debt forward. They rolled out at 0523, 3 trucks moving through the base's north gate during shift change when security was thinnest. The guard on duty, Hayes, coincidentally, saw them coming and made a show of checking his phone, his back turned as they passed. Some rebellions require conspiracies. Others just need people willing to look away. The old mining route was exactly as terrible as James promised. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than packed earth scarred with erosion channels and studded with rocks that tested the truck's suspension with every meter. Dust rose in choking clouds, turning the morning sun into a dim orange disk. James rode in the lead truck with Gilbert, one hand braced against the dashboard, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Every few kilometers, he'd direct them around obstacles. Soft sand ahead, bare left. Wadi crossing in 300 meters. Take it slow. Stop! There's a dead animal at 2 o'clock. Could be natural, could be marking an IED cache. Each time Gilbert followed the guidance and found James was right. You've traveled this route recently, Gilbert said after the 4th correction. I've traveled everywhere within 30 kilometers of Zone 7. Had to. Finding work, scavenging, searching for... James stopped himself. Just had to know the land. You were searching for me. James didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. At the 18-kilometer mark, the radio crackled. Dawson's voice from the second truck. Movement, east side, 200 meters. 4 individuals, armed. Gilbert grabbed the radio. Stop the convoy. Chen, get on the 50 cal. Wait. James's hand caught his arm. Don't. Those are scouts from the local village. They trade with Zone 7. If you point weapons at them, word spreads that Americans are hostile. Red Scars use that recruitment. How can you tell they're not militia? Their weapons? AKs, but old Soviet models, not the Chinese variants Red Scars prefer. And they're moving parallel, not setting up flanking positions. James leaned out the window, raised one hand in a specific gesture, palm out, fingers spread, then closed into a fist. The distant figures stopped. One raised a hand in response, the same gesture in reverse. Then they melted back into the scrub. Gilbert stared. What the hell was that? Refugee sign language. Means peaceful passage. James settled back into his seat. You learn it when you need to communicate without drawing attention. When words can get you killed. They drove on. Zone 7 appeared at 0847 hours, shimmering in the heat like a mirage of desperation. What the official reports called a refugee settlement was actually a sprawling network of canvas tents, scrap metal shelters, and cardboard structures held together with hope and wire. 1,500 people, living on land that could barely support 200. The smell hit first. Human waste. Sickness. Cooking fires fueled by trash. Then the sounds. Children crying, adults arguing in a babel of languages, someone coughing with the wet rattle of pneumonia. Gilbert had seen poverty before, had driven through villages that made his hometown in rural Colorado look like a paradise. But this was different. This was organized abandonment, people warehoused and forgotten, surviving on the dregs of international charity and the world's sporadic attention. The trucks rolled to the settlement center, where a faded UN tarp marked what passed for a community space. People emerged from shelters slowly, warily, their eyes carrying the particular emptiness that comes from too many broken promises. James jumped out before the truck fully stopped. An elderly woman, his mother, Gilbert realized, sat in a wheelchair made from PVC pipe and bicycle wheels. Her face transformed when she saw him, tears streaming as she reached up with trembling hands. They spoke rapidly in a language Gilbert didn't recognize, James kneeling beside her, his hands gentle on her arms. Then he stood and turned to face the growing crowd. "This convoy brings supplies," he said in English, then repeated it in 2 other languages. "Medicine, food, water, enough for 4 months if we ration carefully." "Why, someone shouted. The Americans said they were leaving. James looked back at Gilbert, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or just shared knowledge of what choosing right over easy actually cost. "These Americans are different," James said quietly. "These ones stayed." The next 3 hours passed in organized chaos. James moved through the camp with military precision, identifying the most critical needs and directing distribution accordingly. He knew which families had sick children, which shelters lacked basic sanitation, where the water supplies were most contaminated. He didn't just know the camp, he commanded it. Gilbert watched him coordinate volunteers, establish distribution points, prioritize medical cases, all with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, or something very like it. This wasn't a beggar grateful for charity. This was a logistics officer managing a crisis. "He's good at this," Chen observed, hauling a crate of antibiotics toward the medical tent. "He was trained for it," Gilbert said. "Just not for this side of the operation." By noon, the trucks were empty, and the camp was transformed, not saved, not fixed, but given 4 months of breathing room, 4 months where children wouldn't die from preventable diseases, where mothers wouldn't watch their babies starve. 4 months bought with Gilbert's career. James found him near the trucks, staring at the settlement with an expression Gilbert couldn't read. "Thank you," James said simply. "I should have done it sooner." "Most people never do it at all." James paused. "When you get back, Morrison will destroy you." "I know. Was it worth it?" Gilbert thought about the children he'd seen, their distended bellies and hollow eyes. Thought about James at 9, facing the same desperation that had made him pray for militias. Thought about all the orders he'd followed without questioning where they led. "Yes," he said, "it was worth it." They loaded into the trucks for the return journey, the vehicles lighter, but somehow feeling heavier. As they pulled away, Gilbert looked back and saw James standing with his mother, one hand raised in farewell. A beggar who'd become a soldier who'd become a beggar, a human being who'd survived both and somehow remained human. The desert swallowed them in dust, carrying them back toward whatever consequences waited. Gilbert didn't regret a single kilometer. The first shot came at kilometer 37, just as the convoy cleared a dry wadi where the sand lay soft and treacherous. Chen's head snapped back in a spray of red mist. The engineer slumped against the steering wheel, the laid truck lurching sideways as his dead weight pulled it off course. Gilbert barely had time to register what happened before the world exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes erupted from the dunes on both sides, a classic L-shaped ambush, designed to catch the convoy in a kill zone with nowhere to run. Rounds punched through sheet metal, shattered windows, kicked up geysers of sand. The distinct crack of AK-47s mixed with the heavier punch of a PKM machine gun. "Contact right! Contact left!" Dawson's voice screamed over the radio, high with panic. "We're bracketed! We're fucking bracketed!" Gilbert grabbed the wheel of the lead truck as it careened toward a boulder. His hands fought the dead weight of Chen's body, trying to steer while rounds sparked off the hood. A tire blew with a sound like a cannon shot. The truck spun, tipped, and rolled. The world became a tumbling kaleidoscope of sky, sand, metal. Gilbert's head cracked against something hard. His shoulders screamed. Then gravity reversed, and the truck slammed down on its side, metal shrieking, glass exploding inward in 1,000 crystal fragments. Silence, just for a heartbeat. The stunned quiet after violence that feels like the world holding its breath. Then the shooting resumed, and Gilbert realized he was still alive. He kicked out the shattered windshield, dragging himself through with his M4. Pain lanced through his left leg. Hot, wet, wrong. He looked down and saw the dark stain spreading across his thigh, the fabric torn where a round had punched through muscle. "Dawson! James!" He keyed his radio. Static answered. Either the radio was dead or the others were. The overturned truck provided minimal cover. Rounds hammered against the undercarriage, punching through thin steel. Gilbert returned fire blindly, one-handed, his leg useless beneath him. His tactical training ran through options. Call for support, no radio. Establish defensive position, pinned down. Treat wounded. He was the wounded. Retreat, couldn't walk. Every option ended the same way. 20 meters away, the second truck was burning. He couldn't see Dawson, couldn't see anyone, just smoke and incoming fire, and the absolutely certainty that he'd led good men to die for a gesture that wouldn't matter to anyone except the corpses they'd become. A figure moved in the smoke. Too fast, too low. Not Dawson. Enemy flanking. Gilbert swung his rifle, but his vision swam, blood loss making the world tilt. His shot went wide. The figure kept coming. This is how it ends, Gilbert thought. Bleeding out in the sand, court-martial avoided by death. Then another figure emerged from behind the burning truck, thin, wearing boots too large for him, carrying an XM7 and rifle that looked like it had always belonged in his hands. James. The boy moved like smoke through the chaos, his body low, his steps silent, despite the boots. He reached Gilbert's position and dropped beside him without a word, his eyes scanning the dunes with the 1,000-yard focus of a predator tracking prey. "How many?" James asked, his voice eerily calm. "I don't. Maybe 6, 8? Machine gun nest at 11 o'clock, 200 meters. Riflemen in the dunes." Gilbert fumbled for a tourniquet. "Where's Dawson?" "Wounded but alive. Behind the third truck." James's hands moved across the XM7, checking the chamber, testing the action. His movements were automatic, divorced from conscious thought. The machine gun crew has to go first, then the flankers, then clean up. "You can't. There's too many." "I know." James pressed his cheek against the stock, his breathing slowing into a rhythm Gilbert recognized from sniper training. 4 seconds in. Hold. Fire on the exhale. I've done this before. The first shot cracked like judgment. 200 meters away, in a depression between dunes, a man's head snapped back. The PKM machine gun went silent. James worked the bolt. Smooth, mechanical. Already tracking to the next target. The second shot hit a rifleman trying to flank from the left. He dropped mid-stride, his AK clattering into the sand. "Jesus Christ," Gilbert whispered. James didn't respond. His world had narrowed to breath, heartbeat, target. To the terrible mathematics of killing that he'd learned at 9 and perfected at 13. His hands were perfectly steady. His face showed nothing, not anger, not fear, just the blank efficiency of someone doing a job he'd never wanted but couldn't escape. Third shot, a rebel commander barking orders behind a boulder. He fell silent permanently. Fourth shot, another flanker, this one almost in position to throw a grenade. He fell with the grenade still in his hand, the explosion taking 2 more rebels with him. The incoming fire slowed, then stopped. The surviving rebels, however many remained, had learned the lesson that other men had learned years ago in Relengo province. There was a ghost in the desert, and ghosts couldn't be killed because they were already dead inside. James lowered the rifle slowly. His hands trembled now, the adrenaline crash hitting delayed but inevitable. His eyes, Gilbert saw them clearly for the first time, were glistening. Not with satisfaction or relief, but with something that looked like mourning. "5 confirmed," James said, his voice hollow. "Maybe 2 more wounded. They'll retreat." "Where did you... How did you..." "I told you." James set the XM7 down like it burned to touch. "I learned when missing meant dying." Dawson emerged from behind the third truck, limping, his arm bleeding but functional. He stared at James, then at the dunes, then back at James. "What the fuck just happened?" "The beggars saved our lives," Gilbert said quietly. James stood, swaying slightly. He looked at the rifle on the ground, the weapon that had destroyed his childhood, killed his innocence, and now saved the man who'd once mocked him. His face was unreadable, but his hands clenched and unclenched like he wanted to wash them, but knew no water would ever make them clean. "We need to move," he said. "They'll regroup or call reinforcements. We have maybe 20 minutes. "Chen's dead," Dawson said. "Truck 2 is totaled, and Sarge can't walk." James looked at Gilbert's leg, his expression clinical. He grabbed the medical kit from the overturned truck, applied the tourniquet with practiced efficiency, and packed the wound. His hands were gentle despite their trembling. "Can you drive?" he asked Dawson. "Yeah, but..." "Then get truck 3 running. We'll leave the others." James hauled Gilbert up, supporting his weight with surprising strength. "Sergeant, you're going to lean on me. We're going to walk to that truck. And you're not going to die today." "What?" The question escaped before Gilbert could stop it. "After everything, why save me?" James met his eyes, and in that moment Gilbert saw all of it. The child forced to become a killer. The survivor who'd spent 6 years running from his own skill. The human being who'd been given every reason to let the world burn and had chosen to put out fires anyway. "Because someone has to break the cycle," James said. "And it might as well be me." They reached the base at 1300. Truck 3 limped through the gate, trailing smoke. Its windshield shattered, its sides pocked with bullet holes. Chen's body was wrapped in canvas in the truck bed. Gilbert was barely conscious, blood loss and shock having taken their toll. Dawson was crying silently, his hands locked on the steering wheel, and James sat in the passenger seat, the XM7 across his lap, staring at nothing. Captain Morrison was waiting with military police, his face carved from stone. The court-martial would be swift, Gilbert knew. Unauthorized resource allocation, disobeying direct orders, reckless endangerment, resulting in a soldier's death. All true, all worth it. But as the MPs helped him from the truck, Gilbert looked back at James, this 19-year-old who'd been forced to become a killer twice, once by evil men and once to save good ones, and felt something shift in his understanding of courage. James hadn't picked up that rifle to prove anything, hadn't fired those shots for recognition or redemption. He'd done it because lives were at stake, and he had the terrible skill to save them, and sometimes being human meant using the worst parts of yourself to protect others. "The beggar," Gilbert muttered as the medics loaded him onto a stretcher, blood loss making him delirious. "The beggar saved us all." James stood alone in the compound as they carried Gilbert away, the rifle still in his hands, tears finally falling. Not tears of victory. Tears for the child he'd had to become again, even just for 5 minutes. Tears for the man he could never be, because war had stolen that future before he'd even learned to read. The rifle felt heavier than it ever had. He set it down gently and walked away, leaving it in the dust where all weapons should stay. Behind him, the desert wind erased his footprints like they'd never existed at all. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and blood. Gilbert lay on a cot, his leg elevated, IV drip feeding antibiotics into his system, while doctors debated whether the wound required evacuation to the main hospital in the capital. Through the canvas walls, he could hear Morrison's voice, clipped, furious, promising consequences. Sergeant Farley's actions were insubordinate, reckless, and resulted in the death of PFC Chen. I want a full investigation and court-martial proceedings initiated immediately. But there were other voices too. Dawson's, younger but insistent. "Sir, with respect, Sergeant Farley saved 1,500 civilians, and James, the local, he saved all of us. Without him, we'd all be dead." A local irregular engaged in combat operations? That's another violation. He picked up a rifle to defend Americans under fire. There's precedent for civilian assistance. "Sir, I was there. I saw what he did. 7 shots, 7 kills. He's the only reason I'm alive to have this conversation." The voices faded as someone adjusted the tent flap. Gilbert closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him toward sleep. Chen's face kept appearing, smiling, competent Chen who'd fixed broken equipment and told stories about his grandmother. Dead because Gilbert had chosen principle over protocol. Was it worth it? He thought about the children in Zone 7, now with medicine. The families with food. 4 months of survival purchased with one man's life and another man's career. The math was impossible. Some equations had no right answer. James appeared at sunset, moving silently between the medical cots. He looked different, cleaned up, wearing donated fatigues that almost fit. But his eyes carried the same exhaustion, the same weight. "They're saying you might lose the leg," James said, sitting carefully on a folding chair beside the cot. "They're saying a lot of things." Gilbert tried to sit up, winced. Morrison's pushing for dishonorable discharge. Dawson's fighting him, but orders are orders. James's voice was flat, even when they're wrong. They sat in silence, the tent's shadows lengthening. Outside, the base continued its routine, soldiers drilling, vehicles moving, the machinery of military life grinding forward as if nothing had changed, as if Chen wasn't dead, as if the world wasn't always one decision away from choosing between what was right and what was easy. Gilbert's hand moved to his neck, fingers finding the chain he'd worn for 15 years. He pulled it off, dog tags inscribed with his name, rank, serial number. The metal had worn smooth from touch, from sweat, from the years of service they represented. Here, he pressed them into James's hand. You earned these more than I ever did. James stared at the tags, his fingers closing around them slowly. Then he shook his head and tried to hand them back. I don't want metal, Sergeant. I want meaning. I want a world where children don't learn to kill before they learn to read, where refugees aren't abandoned because they lack strategic value, where doing the right thing doesn't destroy the people who try. His voice cracked on the last word. Gilbert took the tags back, but held James's hand in his. Then help me build it. When this is over, however it ends, I'm going to fight. For Zone 7, for you. I'll push for your recognition, for civilian marksman status under the Peacekeeping Corps. You have skills that could save lives instead of taking them. They'll never accept me now. I'm a former child soldier. You're a survivor who saved American lives under fire. Dawson's writing a commendation. Even Morrison can't ignore that. Gilbert squeezed his hand. You told me soldiers and killers aren't different. Maybe you're right. But soldiers can choose what they fight for. Let me help you choose meaning over metal. James was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. My mother asked about you, he said finally. Wanted to thank the American soldier who saved her twice, once 6 years ago, once yesterday. Tell her, Gilbert paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. Tell her I'm sorry it took me so long to remember what I was supposed to be fighting for. James stood, pocketing the dog tags. Keep these. You might need them to convince Command you're still worth listening to. He managed a small smile. Besides, I don't need metal to remember. I'll remember you either way. He left as silently as he'd come, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Gilbert lay back, his leg throbbing, his career ending, his conscience finally quiet. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like a soldier worth the title. The ceremony was small. A dozen soldiers, a handful of officers, and Captain Morrison, standing rigid in his dress uniform, reading from a prepared statement with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling a bureaucratic obligation. In recognition of exceptional service under combat conditions, and in accordance with Protocol 47B governing civilian auxiliaries, this command grants James Marcus Hawes an honorary position within the Humanitarian Defense Corps, with full training privileges and provisional status pending final clearance. The words droned on, formal and bloodless, transforming 5 perfect shots that saved 3 lives into administrative language. But Gilbert barely heard them. He stood at the edge of the assembly area, leaning on a cane, his legs still healing beneath dress blues that felt foreign after weeks in hospital scrubs. He watched James instead. The boy, no, the young man, stood at attention in a donated uniform that had been tailored to actually fit. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His posture was military perfect, chin up, eyes forward. He'd gained weight over the past 3 weeks, the hollows in his cheeks filling out with regular meals. Someone had cut his hair into something regulation appropriate, but it was his eyes that had changed most. They still carried shadows, would always carry shadows, But something else lived there now, too. Something that looked almost like hope. Morrison pinned a small badge to James's chest, the Humanitarian Defense Corps insignia, a dove and shield intertwined. His voice softened slightly, reluctantly. Your actions saved American lives. That debt is acknowledged. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't recognition of the larger injustice, but it was something. James saluted. Morrison returned it. The assembly applauded politely. As the formalities dissolved into congratulations and handshakes, Gilbert limped forward. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the training field in the same golden light that had illuminated their first meeting. The same sky that had witnessed mockery and money, bets and bullets. James saw him coming and broke away from the small crowd of well-wishers. They stood facing each other, separated by everything they'd been and connected by everything they'd become. I thought you wanted my money, Gilbert said quietly. James smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. No, I wanted a chance. What will you do with it? Teach. James looked toward the firing range where recruits were gathering for afternoon qualifications. Dawson asked if I'd help train the new arrivals, not for combat, for protection, precision shooting for peacekeeping operations, how to disable rather than kill, how to make the shot matter. Gilbert felt something in his chest tighten. That's good. That's exactly what his voice caught. I'm proud of you. Don't be. James's smile faded slightly. I'm not redeemed, Sergeant. I'm just trying to redirect the damage. Turn the skill that killed 30 people into something that might save 31. That's what redemption is. Not erasing the past, just building a different future. They stood in silence as the recruits assembled on the range. Young soldiers, barely older than James, learning to handle weapons they might use to protect or destroy. The choice, Gilbert realized, was always present, always renewed with each trigger pull, each order followed, each moment when power met conscience. James started toward the range, then paused and turned back. He stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute, not the crisp formality of protocol, but something deeper. Recognition between equals. Respect earned through fire and blood and choices that cost everything. Gilbert returned the salute, tears pricking his eyes. Then James walked away, moving toward the recruits with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived hell and chosen to light candles rather than curse the darkness. His voice carried across the field, clear and strong. Marksmanship isn't about killing. It's about control, about discipline, about making certain that when you choose to pull the trigger, you know exactly why you're doing it and what it costs. Gilbert watched him teach, this young man who'd been forced to become a killer twice and had somehow emerged with his humanity intact. Watched the recruits listen with the attention that comes from recognizing truth when they hear it. The sun sank lower, painting everything in gold and shadow. Gilbert stood speechless, not from arrogance this time, but from awe, at the resilience of the human spirit, at the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal into wisdom instead of bitterness. He thought about the $720 he'd waived as a joke, about the money he'd thought determined worth, about all the currencies he'd valued, rank, power, obedience, comfort. That meant nothing compared to this. One young man teaching others that strength wasn't about domination, but about discipline. That power without conscience was just violence wearing medals. Respect, Gilbert finally understood, was the real currency of worth. And James Marcus Hawes, beggar, soldier, survivor, teacher, was the richest man on the base. As the sun touched the horizon, Gilbert saluted one more time, alone now. Saluting the man James had become and the soldier Gilbert was trying to be. The desert wind carried his gesture away into the gathering dark, where all transformations begin and end with a choice to be better than the world expects.